Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. Today's episode explores Pathologies of Power by Paul Farmer. This is not a book review. This is a systems-level analysis of structural violence, global health inequality, and the institutions that convert poverty into bodily suffering.
Yeah, and we are really setting out today to dismantle a very comforting, very pervasive illusion.
Right.
Because as you, the listener, go about your life, you're constantly bombarded with stories of disease like an outbreak of cholera or rising tuberculosis rates or some new malaria epidemic. And the deep-seated tendency in our culture is to view these events as just, well, biological tragedies.
Like a pathogen enters a population and nature just takes its course.
Exactly. Or alternatively, we might look at these crises and attribute them to individual behavioral choices, or maybe some vague notion of a local cultural failing.
By blaming the victims, essentially.
Right. But Paul Farmer, who, operated as both a physician treating the destitute sick and an anthropologist studying their societies, he just fundamentally rejects that premise.
He does.
He argues that survival itself is being meticulously rationed, and it's rationed by wealth, by geography, and by the priorities of massive institutions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when we hear the phrase human rights violations, our minds instinctively pull up a very specific, cinematic set of images.
Oh, absolutely.
We picture visible dictators in military fatigues, political prisons, censorship, secret police. Those are the gross, loud violations that get condemned by international tribunals.
Lots of stuff that makes the evening news.
Exactly. But we are talking about a completely different paradigm here. I am trying to wrap my head around the mechanics of this.
Okay.
How exactly does a hospital billing department, a development policy written in a foreign capital, or a global health metric commit a human rights abuse?
Well, that is the pivotal question of this entire deep dive. It really requires us to shift how we perceive causality. I want you to consider how often you might read about mortality rates dropping in a specific underfunded zip code near you, or a famine in the global south. And you instinctively just chalk it up to bad luck.
Like it's just an accident of nature.
Exactly. But the core thesis here is that these outcomes are not accidents of nature. They are the predictable outputs of a system working exactly as it was engineered to work.
Wow.
Yeah. And to see this clearly, we have to entirely redefine the word violence.
Because usually, the word violence implies a kinetic event.
Right.
It requires an actor, someone holding a weapon, making a conscious choice to strike.
Which is exactly why Farmer introduces the framework of structural violence.
Structural violence.
Yeah, these are historically given, economically driven processes that conspire to constrain human agency. It's like a slow, quiet, bureaucratic brutality.
So does it require an evil dictator pulling a trigger?
Not at all. It operates seamlessly through the everyday, mundane functioning of our social and economic systems. We are talking about the systemic denial of economic opportunity, the engineering of food deserts, and the withholding of basic health care.
And the data presented in the text to back this up, it completely upends the way we usually map global suffering.
Oh, it really does.
Because we tend to think of this as an over-there problem, right? Like a tragedy of the developing world.
Right, something far away.
But Farmer and Amartya Sen point out that the life expectancy for African Americans in some of the most prosperous U.S. cities, like New York or San Francisco, has at times been lower than for people living in immensely poorer countries like China or India.
Yeah, that is just a staggering metric.
It really is. It proves mathematically that mere geographic proximity to immense wealth, literally living in the shadow of the greatest medical institutions on Earth, does not equal access to survival.
Exactly. It forces us to ask why that gap exists. If the medicine is physically in the building down the street, but a population is still dying of treatable conditions, the barrier isn't biological.
It's structural.
It's structural. And this introduces a massive challenge in how we even communicate this reality.
Right.
In the foreword to the text, Amartya Sen praises Farmer's methodology by invoking the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Oh, yeah, the ostensive method of teaching. I geeked out over this part.
It's so good, right? If you want to teach someone what a slab is, you do not write a 30-page academic paper defining the molecular structure of concrete.
Or the geometrical properties of a rectangular prism.
No, you just point to a slab.
You literally point at the rock and say, that is a slab.
Right.
But wait, if Farmer is dealing with systems as complex as international finance and global health architecture, Why abandon the academic definitions?
It's a fair question.
Doesn't a concept like structural violence demand rigorous sociological language?
Well, it demands rigor, sure, but Farmer argues that sociological jargon often acts as an anesthetic.
An anesthetic, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, because when you try to define complex social suffering with, sterile, epigrammatic, academic language, the reality of the suffering just evaporates.
The jargon hides the bodies.
Exactly. So Farmer refuses to give a neat definition. Instead, he uses the ostensive method. He points to the bodies of the destitute sicky treats in rural Haiti, in the shantytowns of Peru, and in the prisons of Russia. He uses exhaustive case studies to preserve the shady, messy edges of human suffering that get completely erased when we just aggregate them into a statistical table.
Right, because the statistic doesn't bleed, it doesn't gasp for air.
No, it doesn't.
And by pointing at the actual human toll, the text exposes a massive, glaring contradiction in the global framework of human rights.
Absolutely.
It's like, let's look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It includes social and economic rights, the right to food, housing, and medical care.
Yeah.
But modern institutions, the ones we interact with and hear about in the media, they obsess almost exclusively over civil and political rights, voting, free speech, freedom from arbitrary arrest.
We have completely bifurcated human rights. We treat the political dictator as an abomination, which obviously they are.
Of course.
But then we treat the preventable death of a child from a waterborne illness as just a sad, natural background condition.
Right. We view the lack of freedom to speak as an outrage, but the lack of freedom to survive as just an economic reality.
Yeah.
It's like being handed a shiny new constitution, guaranteeing your absolute right to vote and criticize the government, but you're actively dying of a bacterial infection that costs $2 to cure.
Right, exactly.
I mean, what good is a ballot box if you're starving or suffering from tuberculosis? You can't eat a ballot. A ballot doesn't synthesize antibodies.
That tension right there, that is the pulse of the entire analysis. We really have to look at the mechanisms that separate the right to speak from the right to live.
So, let's do what Farmer does. Let's point at the slab. We need to move from this abstract theory of rights and look at a specific human life to trace the invisible mechanics of structural violence. And the text provides the story of Asefi Joseph, a young woman from the rural village of Kay in Haiti's Central Plateau.
Yeah, and to really understand Asefi's illness, we cannot start at the moment of infection.
Right.
We have to start decades earlier with the geography and the economy of her village.
Exactly, because her family initially was not destitute. They were prosperous peasants living in a fertile river valley.
They had a good setup.
They grew rice, bananas, millet, sugarcane.
Yeah.
They had a sustainable economic engine, and therefore they had agency. But then an external system intervenes. In the mid-20th century, a massive internationally funded development project, the Pilgrim Dam, is constructed to provide hydroelectric power. And this is primarily for the capital city and industrial interests.
Right, not for the locals.
Not at all. The valley is flooded to create a reservoir. And the villagers, who have absolutely no political voice to resist this, are completely displaced.
Yeah, they're just pushed out.
They aren't given adequate alternatives or compensation. So Asefi's family becomes water refugees. They are pushed up into the stony, arid, chalky hills above the waterline. The soil is terrible. They can't grow their crops. Grinding, inescapable poverty sets in.
Just stop there for a moment and look at the mechanism.
Yeah.
A bureaucratic decision made in a capital city, funded by international banks, literally pulls the economic foundation out from under a family.
Right.
Their subsequent poverty was not a failure of their farming skills or, a natural drought. It was engineered by an external economic system prioritizing urban power generation over rural survival.
So the environment is primed, the family is starving, and to survive, Asefi takes what miserable, meager produce they can scrape together from the chalky soil and carries it down the mountain to the local market. On this route, there's a military checkpoint. The soldiers, part of a military regime, watch the local women. And a soldier named Captain Honorat takes an interest in Asefi.
Yeah.
He is married, he is known to have other partners, but we have to analyze the power dynamic here. He represents state military power, and he has a steady salary.
While Asefi is a starving, displaced refugee.
Exactly.
What's fascinating here is where we encounter what Farmer calls the cognitivist personalistic pole of analysis.
Okay.
When Nacifi inevitably contracts HIV from this soldier, how does the traditional public health community or society at large analyze her situation?
Well, let me play devil's advocate here, channeling that traditional view.
Go for it.
The argument would be, she made a choice. She is a human being with agency. She chose to engage with a married soldier. She didn't practice safe sex. Therefore, the outcome, while tragic, is a result of individual behavioral failings or perhaps a lack of health education.
Right, that's the classic take.
So where is the line between a constrained choice and having no choice at all?
Well, the line is drawn by the structure surrounding the individual. The cognitivist personalistic view isolates the moment of infection from the decades of history that forced her to that checkpoint.
It just looks at that one interaction.
Exactly. It assumes she was operating in a vacuum of pure free will. But Farmer violently dismantles this. He forces us to look at the structural pull.
Right.
Asifi's risk of contracting AIDS was structured years before she ever met Captain Honorat.
Because of the dam?
Yes. It was structured by the international finance that funded the dam. It was structured by the displacement that drove her family to starvation, forcing her to walk past a military checkpoint just to survive. It was structured by a deeply entrenched gender dynamic that left a poor rural woman effectively powerless against a salaried man with a gun in a militarized state. By the time he spoke to her, her choices were essentially non-existent.
Right. Because refusing him wasn't just turning down a date.
No, it was navigating the threat of military violence and rejecting a potential, albeit desperate, source of economic survival.
And the mechanics of her tragedy just continue to unfold long after the soldier dies of unexplained fevers, which is clearly AIDS.
Yeah.
Asafi tries to build a life. She moves to Port-au-Prince, finding work as a domestic servant for a tiny wage. She meets another man, Blanco, also a water refugee. They plan to marry, but she becomes pregnant.
And then the safety net vanishes completely.
Instantly. The moment she is pregnant, Blanco abandons her. The moment her employer discovers the pregnancy, she is fired.
Wow.
The disease progresses. She returns to her village where there is no advanced medical infrastructure, and she dies, leaving behind an infected child.
It's just devastating.
When you trace this entire timeline, you realize that at no point did a dictator put a gun to her head. Yet she was killed by a system just the same.
To the listener, I really want you to seriously reflect on the concept of agency in your own life. Think about the choices you made today. How much of what we consider our free will is actually just us navigating a very narrow hallway built by economic forces far beyond our control?
That's a great metaphor, a narrow hallway.
Right. And if your hallway only leads to starvation on one end and exploitation on the other, are you really making a choice? Or are you just selecting the method of your own slow destruction?
Wow.
The cognitivist personalistic view is incredibly comforting to the affluent world. It allows us to look at a crisis and say, they just need better education.
Yeah.
It completely absolves the systems of power that flooded the valley in the first place.
So what does this all mean? If we accept that the system is setting the parameters of doom for people like Isufi, we have to look at the institutions that hold the cures.
We do.
Because Farmer doesn't just analyze the victims. He rigorously dissects the incentive structures of the perpetrators. We need to examine the architecture of the neoliberal era and market-based medicine.
Yeah, and the text defines neoliberalism in this specific context as an ideology that views individuals almost exclusively as autonomous, rational producers and consumers operating in a competition-driven market.
Okay.
It is a belief system assuming that the laws of supply and demand are entirely sufficient to organize human survival.
Which brings to mind a quote Farmer pulls from the author Wendell Berry. He says, "Rats and roaches live by competition under the law of supply and demand. It is the privilege of human beings to live under the laws of justice and mercy."
That's a powerful quote.
It really is. Because when you apply a pure market ethos to the distribution of life-saving medicine, the result isn't efficiency. It's a catastrophic perversion of healing.
And this leads us to one of the most counterintuitive yet mathematically undeniable concepts in the text.
The outcome gap.
Yes, the outcome gap.
Let's run a thought experiment to illustrate how the outcome gap works, because I think this is crucial.
Okay, let's do it.
Imagine, tomorrow morning, a brilliant team of scientists announces they've cured a highly lethal, previously untreatable form of cancer. They have a pill, it works perfectly. What happens next?
Well, you would assume that global health immediately improves across the board.
Right. But the outcome gap suggests the exact opposite happens in terms of inequality.
Yes. Because the market dictates the distribution. that new, miraculous, highly complex drug is going to be incredibly expensive.
Of course.
So it instantly becomes available to the affluent populations in the developed world. Their mortality rates for this cancer drop to zero.
But what about the destitute sick?
Right. The billion people living in dire poverty, they cannot afford the pill. So they continue to die of the exact same cancer at the exact same rate.
But the nature of their death has fundamentally transformed.
Exactly. They are no longer dying of an untreatable biological tragedy. They are now dying of a disease that is entirely curable.
The Haitians have a phrase for this that Farmer quotes, don't they?
Yes, a stupid death.
A stupid death. God, that's heavy. The invention of the cure actually widened the health gap between the rich and the poor.
Faster medical progress leads to worse relative outcomes for the destitute because survival is treated as a commodity rather than a right.
But I mean, I want to push back here, or at least look at the complexity of the institutions trying to manage this.
Sure.
It's not just ruthless pharmaceutical executives hoarding pills, right? Farmer is deeply critical of public health bureaucracies, the organizations whose stated mission is to help.
Oh, absolutely.
He points out how they weaponize bureaucratic terms like cost-effectiveness, sustainability, and replicability. Let's look at the mechanics of this. How does a global health official in Geneva or Washington actually use a spreadsheet to deny care?
They use metrics like DALYs. That stands for Disability-Adjusted Life Years.
Okay.
It is a mathematical formula used to quantify the burden of disease. It basically calculates the years of life lost to premature death and the years lived with a disability.
So wait, if I'm a bureaucrat looking at a limited budget and I use a daily calculation, how does that translate into action on the ground?
Well, the math inherently favors treating the easiest, cheapest conditions in populations that are otherwise healthy.
Right.
If you have a set amount of money, the spreadsheet will tell you that treating one patient with a complex, expensive disease like multidrug-resistant tuberculosis in a slum is not cost-effective.
Because it takes up too much of the budget.
Exactly. The formula suggests you could use that same money to give cheap vitamin A supplements to 500 people instead.
So it's the efficacy-equity trade-off.
Yes, exactly. The metric appears highly rational, sterile, and scientific. It looks like good stewardship of donor funds.
So what is the predictable outcome of that math?
It is the calculated mathematical abandonment of the sickest, most vulnerable people on Earth.
Wow.
It is a system that decides mechanically that a human life in a certain zip code is simply not worth the financial investment required to save it.
And what happens when you abandon those people? The text maps out a feedback loop of structural violence that is terrifying in its efficiency.
It really is.
Let's trace the biology and the economics of this loop. First, you have poverty. A lack of clean water, poor nutrition, crowded living conditions. This exponentially increases your exposure to pathogens, so you get sick.
And getting the disease then deepens your poverty. You lose the ability to work, just like ACFE did.
Right. And because you are now deeply impoverished, you get inadequate treatment. You don't get the full 6-month course of modern antibiotics. You get a fractured, inconsistent supply. Now, what does inadequate treatment do biologically? This is crucial. If you give a pathogen just enough antibiotics to kill the weak bacteria, but not enough to eradicate the infection, you aren't curing the patient.
No, you're not.
You are running an evolutionary training camp for the bacteria. You are actively selecting for resistant strains. The pathogen mutates. You have now engineered a drug-resistant disease.
And drug resistance massively raises the cost of treatment.
Oh, massively.
Yeah, first-line TB drugs might cost $20. Second-line drugs for resistant TB can cost thousands.
And here is the ultimate brutal irony of the system. That artificially inflated higher cost is then used by the bureaucrats as the exact mathematical justification to deny you treatment entirely.
Yes.
Look at the spreadsheet and say, treating this drug-resistant strain is simply not cost-effective.
It is a closed-loop machine. The system creates the poverty breeds the disease, the system's inadequate response mutates the disease, and the resulting cost of the mutation is used to justify letting the patient die.
Unbelievable.
It converts poverty directly into bodily suffering while allowing the architects of the system to wash their hands, claiming they are just following the objective laws of economics.
Well, if we want to see the most distilled, undeniable manifestation of this systemic abandonment, we have to look at an environment where human agency isn't just constrained by poverty. It is legally, forcibly stripped away by the state.
Right.
We are moving from the rural hills of Haiti to the prison system in Russia in the late 1990s and early 2000s.
The text provides an exhaustive look at the epidemic of multidrug-resistant tuberculosis, or MDR-TB, incubating inside the post-Soviet penitentiary system.
Let's look at the physical reality of these spaces. We're talking about massive, decaying facilities, severe overcrowding, poor ventilation, inadequate heating,
Terrible conditions.
and profound malnutrition among the inmates, many of whom are young men awaiting trial for incredibly minor, nonviolent infractions.
Right.
Biologically speaking, it is a perfect incubator for an airborne pathogen. They are breathing on each other constantly. And because the medical infrastructure inside the prisons had collapsed, they were receiving incredibly erratic treatments.
Yeah.
A few pills here, a missed month there.
And as we just discussed, this is how you mathematically engineer drug resistance.
Exactly.
We really have to pause and look at the profound ethical and legal hypocrisy occurring here.
Okay.
The fundamental purpose of a prison in any society is the restriction of liberty. It is a punishment administered by the state.
Right.
But sickness, agonizing suffering, and death by an airborne pathogen are not supposed to be part of the judicial sentence. No judge bangs a gavel and sentences a man to 3 years of liberty restriction and a fatal mutating lung disease.
But the state has taken total monopoly control over the inmate's body. The prisoner cannot leave to go to a pharmacy. They cannot seek a second opinion. Their reliance on the state for survival is absolute.
Absolutely.
Therefore, when the state fails to treat them, when it allows an infectious disease to run rampant, it isn't just a failure of healthcare. It is active structural murder.
Exactly.
The system turns a curable bacterial infection into a de facto death penalty.
And this reality leads to one of the most revealing, staggering anecdotes in Farmer's entire analysis. It exposes the exact moment when the logic of market-based public health collides with the reality of human suffering.
Okay, tell me about this.
Well, Farmer and his colleagues were heavily involved in trying to secure treatment for these Russian prisoners.
There was a proposed massive loan from the World Bank to the Russian government, right? Specifically intended to purchase TB drugs. And the Russian TB specialists, the doctors working inside the prisons, watching these inmates literally cough up their lungs, begged the World Bank to include a tiny fraction of funding in the loan for nutritional supplements, food, because the prisoners were starving.
And from a purely biological standpoint, antibiotics are essentially toxic chemicals that rely on the host's immune system to help clear the infection.
Right.
If the patient is severely malnourished, their immune system is entirely compromised. You cannot throw harsh second-line antibiotics at a starving man and expect his body to endure the treatment, let alone heal.
But let me try to understand the mindset of the consultants who push back against this. Let's look at the World Bank experts' perspective.
Okay.
If I am an economist advising on this loan, my mandate is pharmaceutical efficacy. My spreadsheet measures the cost of a pill against the eradication of a bacillus. Is there a cold logic to saying, our budget is for medicine, not groceries? If we spend money on food, we buy fewer pills and therefore treat fewer people.
I mean, that is exactly the logic they used. Farmer recounts bitter arguments with highly paid U.S. and European technical consultants. These experts argued vehemently against including food. They insisted the drugs would work fine with or without the prisoners being malnourished. They cited cost-effectiveness.
It's just so disconnected from reality.
The pathology of that worldview is that it treats the biological organism, the bacteria, as entirely separate from the social and physical reality of the human host. It is the ultimate desocialization of disease.
And what makes this debate over pennies for food supplements absolutely grotesque is the macroeconomic context happening simultaneously.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Farmer points out the staggering irony here. This intense fight over whether a sick, imprisoned human being deserved a few extra calories to survive an antibiotic regimen was happening during the exact same period that an estimated $230 billion in capital flight flowed out of Russia into the global financial system.
$230 billion. Let that sink in.
Right. The system routinely claims there are limited resources when it comes to the poor. We are told we must be endlessly pragmatic, so frugal, so rigorously cost-effective when calculating the worth of a prisoner's life or a peasant's survival.
Always tightening the belt.
Yet, at the exact same moment, hundreds of billions of dollars are flowing infinitely upward to the global elite. The resources exist. The wealth exists.
It's not a scarcity problem.
No. The decision to withhold a nutritional supplement from a dying inmate is not a law of economics. It is a political choice. It is a pathology of power.
which forces us to confront a massive, uncomfortable question. If millions of people are dying from this structural violence, if they are dying of treatable diseases, and the wealth and the medicine clearly exist to save them, how does the affluent world sleep at night?
That's the real question.
How do we tolerate this?
Yeah.
The text doesn't let us off the hook. It points the lens directly at the systems that curate our reality, the systems that shape what we are allowed to see and what we are trained to ignore. We have to look at the media and academia.
Yeah. Farmer quotes the Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano, who stated, "Our system is one of detachment, to keep silenced people from asking questions, to keep the judged from judging, to keep solitary people from joining together, and the soul from putting together its pieces."
That's haunting.
The neoliberal era, Farmer argues, is fundamentally defined by the social production of invisibility. The extreme suffering of the global poor is purposefully and systematically excluded from the consciousness of the affluent.
And what's disturbing is how academic disciplines, which we rely on for truth, often collude in this detachment.
Oh, for sure.
Farmer critiques his own fields of anthropology and medicine. He argues that experts often engage in what he calls chicanery.
Right.
They write massive peer-reviewed papers that desocialize an epidemic. They will analyze a massive outbreak of a disease and treat it merely as a biological puzzle or a quirky local cultural practice regarding hygiene.
They completely erase the massive historical structures.
Yeah.
The history of colonialism, the extraction of wealth, the crushing international debt structures.
And they simply conclude, well, the local health infrastructure is just weak.
Right. It creates a narrative that naturalizes the suffering. But we also see how visibility is actively weaponized by the media to serve political ends.
Yeah. The text offers a brilliant, infuriating contrast regarding two groups of people living with HIV on the exact same island in the early 1990s.
Let's get into this.
Let's explore the geopolitics of this.
Yeah.
On one side of the island, you have HIV-positive Haitian refugees. Following a brutal military coup in Haiti, thousands fled by boat. They were intercepted by the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm.
Those who tested positive for HIV were taken to the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, specifically Camp Bulkley.
Right.
They were detained indefinitely in squalid conditions. They were not charged with a crime. They were locked up purely because they were sick and seeking asylum.
And their voices were almost entirely silenced.
Yes. The U.S. media barely covered the structural and human rights abuses happening on an American military installation.
But look at what was happening right next door on the rest of the island. You had Cuban citizens who were HIV positive living in state-run AIDS sanatoriums.
Right.
Both situations, Guantanamo and the Cuban sanatoriums, involved quarantine and the restriction of movement.
But the international media, particularly the U.S. press, was absolutely obsessed with the Cuban sanatorium.
Oh, they couldn't get enough of it.
They published endless exposés criticizing Cuba for grotesque human rights violations regarding their HIV patients.
This is exactly how the system of perception operates. The media hyperfixates on the suffering that is politically convenient, like condemning a geopolitical rival like Cuba,
Right.
while completely erasing the identical, arguably more brutal human rights abuse being perpetrated by the U.S. military against poor Black refugees just a few miles away.
Oh.
We are only allowed to see the structural violence that serves the prevailing narrative.
We see a similar attempt to control the narrative regarding bioethics, specifically when comparing historical atrocities to modern practices.
Oh, the Tuskegee comparison.
Yes. The text brings up the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, where researchers observed the natural progression of untreated syphilis in Black men, deliberately withholding treatment.
And we universally condemn that today.
Absolutely. But Farmer asks, what is the functional difference between Tuskegee and modern placebo-controlled trials for HIV drugs in developing nations, where the standard of care is deliberately kept lower than in the West?
That is such a sharp point.
In both cases, researchers are observing preventable death under the guise of scientific necessity, rationalizing it by saying, well, they wouldn't have received the medicine anyway.
Right. It's a shift from observing natural death to observing systemic death. But the ethical failure is identical.
And this brings us to a group that understood this weaponized invisibility perfectly and actively fought against it. The Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico.
Yeah, the Zapatista uprising in 1994, which occurred right as the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, went into effect.
Right.
It is vital to understand what they were fighting for. The Zapatistas were not just fighting a traditional guerrilla war over abstract Marxist ideology.
No.
They were fighting against Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution, which threatened indigenous land rights. And they were explicitly fighting for the right to health. They were fighting against a system that demanded they die quietly of preventable diseases in the mountains.
They issued statements recognizing that you cannot separate the biological sickness in their bodies, the malnutrition, the maternal mortality rates from the political sickness of the state and global economic policies.
Exactly.
They understood that their lack of health was a direct political outcome of their lack of democracy. They refused to be a silent statistic.
They forced the world to look at the slab.
They did.
And this leads us to the most urgent question of the entire analysis. We have mapped the architecture of structural violence. We have seen how markets prioritize profitable patients, how bureaucracies use math to justify abandonment, and how the media engineers invisibility.
Right. So what is the treatment for this pathology of power?
Well, this is where Farmer pivots from diagnosis to prescription. He introduces a framework borrowed heavily from Latin American liberation theology, the concept of pragmatic solidarity. Pragmatic solidarity. I like that. Yeah. Liberation theology is anchored by a radical principle called the preferential option for the poor.
Okay.
In the context of medicine and human rights, this is a total rejection of academic detachment. It means you do not just observe suffering objectively, write a peer-reviewed paper about the cultural context, and move on.
Right. You can't just be an observer.
You observe it, you judge it as a profound and unacceptable injustice, and then you take action. That action is pragmatic solidarity.
Okay, so what does that look like on the ground?
It means standing alongside the destitute sick and rapidly deploying your tools, your technology, and your resources to heal them, completely regardless of whether a bureaucrat thinks it is cost-effective.
It is the absolute refusal to accept sustainability as an excuse for human sacrifice. And this wasn't just theory for Farmer. He and his organization, Partners in Health, operationalized this. They went into the slums of Peru and the prisons of Russia and treated multidrug-resistant tuberculosis when the World Health Organization literally said it was impossible and too expensive for developing settings.
They did.
They went into rural Haiti and treated HIV with complex antiretroviral therapies when international experts claimed that poor peasants wouldn't be able to tell time well enough to adhere to the pill schedules.
I mean, they defied the spreadsheets. They just did it. And they proved the massive global health institutions wrong. Because when you treat a human being with dignity, when you address their social reality alongside their biological reality and actually provide the resources, they survive.
And this brings us back to the sheer, undeniable absurdity of the limited resources argument.
Oh, absolutely.
We are constantly told we have to make hard choices about who lives and dies because there just isn't enough money. But Farmer points out the reality of global wealth. We live in a world right now where individual human beings possess personal net worths exceeding $100 billion.
Yeah.
Let that sink in. $100 billion controlled by a single person.
The wealth exists. The medicine exists. The logistical networks to deliver a package anywhere on Earth overnight exist.
We do not suffer from a lack of resources.
No, we suffer from a catastrophic failure of distribution and a grotesque lack of moral imagination. The decision to let millions die of tuberculosis, malaria, and AIDS is not an economic necessity. It is a choice.
Which brings us to the core thesis. I want to ask this explicitly.
Yeah.
What is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis in perception is our deep-seated, heavily conditioned tendency to fragment our reality. It is our tendency to see a disease strictly as a biological event happening to an isolated body. It is our tendency to accept grinding, systemic poverty as a natural background condition, like the weather, rather than a deliberate economic architecture.
Right.
And it is our tendency to view human rights solely as political freedom, the right to cast a ballot or speak freely, while remaining entirely blind to the deeper interconnected system that quietly, mechanically, and ruthlessly decides whose life is made treatable and whose death is made ordinary and acceptable.
Wow.
We are trained to perceive the dictator's bullet, but we are entirely blind to the bureaucrat's spreadsheet.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and it's a final thought I want to leave with you, the listener, to mull over long after this deep dive ends. If our comfortable, affluent lives in the developed world, our cheap consumer goods, our thriving stock portfolios, our access to advanced medical care, if those things are directly subsidized by a global economic order that absolutely guarantees a massive silent body count among the poor in places like Haiti or Chiapas or sub-Saharan Africa, are we actively choosing to define human rights as only political rights, specifically so we don't have to share our wealth? Because if we truly admitted that access to modern medicine, clean water, and food are fundamental, non-negotiable human rights, would the affluent world be guilty of the greatest ongoing crime against humanity in history?
That is the terrifying essential question that Pathologies of Power forces us to confront.
Crisis in perception is not about telling people what to think. It is about making the systems shaping perception more visible. Because when structural forces remain hidden, meaningful change becomes far more difficult to imagine. Crisis in perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
Yeah.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis in perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
Right.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.